10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Delta Fringe, we have ignition.
Welcome to Delta Fringe Podcast with Thomas Withington. He's one of the clearest voices in electronic warfare and radar analysis. He spent years studying how sensors, jammers, EW, early warning systems shape modern defense. Hopefully you don't get a huge head here, Thomas, or Dr. Thomas, I should say. We're going to unpack what's really happening inside the spectrum. We really want to focus today on Russia, Ukraine, without, giving Russia a clear advantage of what's going on there for sure. And really, what is exactly EW, right? There's a lot of misconceptions, and there's just a lot of different fiefdoms with EW. And definitely, what does the future of deterrence look like? So welcome, Dr. Tom, and welcome to being the first victim of the Delta Fringe podcast. So this is it. I never podcasted before. Delta Fringe is obviously a startup consulting company. So when I asked you, I was super excited that you accepted. So thank you very much.
Well, Luke, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm very, very honored to be your first guest, I must say. And I hope I don't disappoint. But I know you and we had a really good chat a couple of weeks ago. Yes. I was really, really pleased that you reached out. And so really looking forward to our conversation today. And I do think there's a lot of things that we can cover. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I really appreciate it. And I'm, like I said, it's the first one, so this may be a little bit messy, but that's what editing's for. I really want to start with before we get into electronic warfare and what all that is, I've seen your name out there for years, and I got some books I'm going to talk about what I read personally and what really triggered me reaching out to you. What got you to this point? And it's okay if you take some time on this journey, the time to explain this journey, but I think that's super important because you look at these young folk and they're out there saying, hey, I want to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, or, plumber or carpenter, whatever. There's these pockets of jobs, I would say, in industry that people aren't even really aware about how exciting they are, how challenging they are, and what an impact they make for national security and the warfighter. So if you kind of walk us through that, and whatever you're comfortable with, by the way, you can start with your wee little lad, knee-high to the grasshopper, all the way up to where you are today. I'm really interested in that as much as you want to share.
Well, it's funny that you should mention when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, because the other week I was very lucky to go to the Royal Air Force Museum in Cosford in central England, which is not far from the city of my birth, which is Birmingham. And I have a very strong connection with Cosford because it was the first air museum that I ever visited at the tender age of about 4 years old. And my granddad took me there. My grandfather worked in the aviation industry. He worked for a contractor called Doughty, Bolton and Paul. And Bolton and Paul, back as they were in the Second World War, built an aircraft called the Bolton and Paul Defiant, which has the distinction of being the world's first ever dedicated electronic warfare aircraft. We can come on to that later on.
That's cool.
But anyhow, so I, at the tender age of 4, went to Cosford Air Museum and I got hooked. I was hooked on military aviation. I thought this was absolutely fascinating. I still am. Anyway, fast forward many, many years later.
I'm just going to interrupt that really quick question on that. So when you're 4, you see all this stuff at the museum. It's like, wow, I had a similar experience when I was a child. I lived near an Air Force base in Rome, New York. It's called Griffiths, and they used to have Commander's Day. And it's like just stimulation overload. So when you're at that age, you said your grandfather was involved in this stuff. Did he kind of feed that as well? Or was it, you went off you did your own side stuff and kind of nurtured that yourself? Or did your family kind of rally around you and say, hey, Tom's interested in this? Let's kind of,
it's a good question. I do blame my granddad as the gateway drug, actually. Yeah, I do. I mean, I've got a memory of us we were going on holiday, and it was one Christmas, and I remember me and him were sat by the wing of this large Lockheed TriStar, British Airways TriStar, that we're flying on to go on holiday. I remember him pointing at the engines and explaining they were Rolls-Royce engines and how the engines worked and things. So this was something I think he'd realised I was really interested at this young age, and then he just kind of fed this stuff through. So this just sort of kept me fascinated. The two things I loved as a kid were trains, and there were trains and aircraft, and I still do. There is no hope for me. There's no going back from this. No intervention can save me.
Do you into model trains as well?
I do. I like full size trains. I like model trains. I find there's something very relaxing about the whole world of rail travel and trains in general. I'm lucky I live near a railway station, so occasionally I do find myself gazing outside the window, watching the trains coming and going, which is a very nice way of spending a few minutes. But yeah, I mean, subsequent to the museum, I mean, I got very lucky after my studies that I got the opportunity to work at a think tank in London, defence and security think tank. And I got involved with working on a big research project, operational analysis research project. So for those folk who are out there who maybe not familiar with operational analysis or OA, this really focuses on looking at military factors and then, broadly speaking, attaching mathematical weightings to factors like success and failure, and using that to try and then design things like war games and exercises and try and understand military capability and how it can prevail.
So if you could, Thomas, dumb that down for me. Is it you got these different scenarios, and it could be with regards to radar trying to get through, or comms, or jammers, or maybe weapons packages, and then you go through and you guys try to game this out, and then you give the probability of success, failure, and what the Q of R is on that. Is that essentially what that is?
I couldn't have put it better myself, Lee. You've absolutely summed it up, and it can expand. I mean, it can be all kinds of things like, why did that platoon not manage to cross the bridge? What were the factors that stopped them? I mean, the possibilities are almost endless with it. And I got involved with looking at the electronic warfare side of various battles and campaigns that we looked at as part of the wider study. Now, I knew nothing about these subjects at all. I mean, I'm a history major, mathematics and physics was not my thing. It was terrible.
Hey, well, wait a minute. Back up. So you went to college for university for history.
Yeah.
And then after, when you got into industry, you started learning about math and algorithms and RF and physics and all of that? Or was there some adjacency within the university where you kind of picked up some of that?
No, I didn't know anything. I mean, I learned as I was going through, and it was a bitter learning curve. But I think what was interesting about it was that when I did maths and physics at school, and I was never really very good at it, I think the difference was when I was doing it as part of my work, you suddenly had a lot of things in context.
That's right.
If you were thinking about learning things like Pythagoras' theorem, or you were looking at things like probabilistic equations, logarithms, all these kind of things, stuff that in your own work, Lou, you would have been very familiar with. When you suddenly have a case study you can apply it to, or examples you can apply it to, suddenly the pennies, do start to fall into place. And so I got really kind of hooked on it. And I think with EW, what it was that there's always been such a strong symbiotic link between the worlds of air power and electronic warfare.
That's right.
I mean, I'm going to sound controversial and say that probably for many years, but for many years, air power was probably the primary driver in the EW community.
Sure.
I think that's it's maybe changed a little bit now, but it was the case certainly Second World War and Cold War era. And after that, I mean, after working for the think tank, when I became a consultant effectively, I got very lucky and I got the opportunity to go away and do a PhD, which I did, which the Royal Air Force very kindly sponsored me to do. And that looked at the use of electronic warfare to support air operations. And I've kind of done that ever since, really, looking at EW across the land, sea, air, space, cyberspace environments to try and understand it. And I still feel like a very enthusiastic student.
No, that's a good background. What year, when when you got your doctorate, right, in this stuff, what year are we talking? Are we in the late 80s, 90s?
Oh,
2000?
no, much later. I mean, this would have been about the mid 2000s.
2000s.
Not the mid 2000s, well, mid 2010. So about the 2015, 16, 17 time frame round about there.
So what's interesting with this is if you look at our careers, I've been at this for 30 years, and there's definitely a transition when silicon became ubiquitous, right? The FPGA, all of a sudden people woke up. It's almost like what they're doing for GPU now. They're saying, oh my gosh, we got all these vector processing engines. Look, we can do massively parallel. The FPGA, really usurped a lot of ASIC technology, which were long, expensive, and just all of that to qual. And you got Xilinx, Altera coming on the scene. Did you see similar trends that I saw where, the capability was exponential? People, like when I was at Lockheed, we dreamt that, digital at every element, or a better DRFM, a digital RF memory, which is simply recording RF, playing it back out. Did that impact any of your work on how technology is really making silicon just for everybody, kind of resetting the asymmetric advantage, if you will?
Yeah, I think it really did. I mean, one of the things I do remember was when looking, for example, at the kind of birth of EW in World War II, was seeing that tasks that were taking engineers and scientists considerable amount of time, even in the crucible of war where innovation does tend to accelerate, with things like when digital radio frequency memory comes in, these tasks could be done in seconds, if that. I mean, it was just the big hallmark for me in electronic warfare, looking back over the sort of 80 years now that we've had it used en masse, it's the acceleration.
That's right.
The functionality, I think the mission set, let's talk, if we talk about the air domain, the mission set primarily, I would argue, for electronic warfare is fundamentally to get aircraft over their objective, performing their mission, or let's say get aircraft to perform their objective or mission safely and return safely.
That's
fundamentally,
right.
That's what airborne EW is all about. And ideally, to try and prevent the bad
That's
folk
right.
doing that same thing. And so that mission set is as relevant today as it was over the skies of Western Europe or over the skies of the Asia Pacific in World War II. What's changed is the speed that we can do those things, and it's that digitization, that advent of things like DRFM. And what I remember, another thing that sticks in my mind was in the sort of late 90s when I was starting to do this work, early 2000s, we were moving away from, I was still seeing monolithic airborne EW systems that were designed, for specific airframes to do a specific task.
Yep.
And it was the advent of the 4.5 generation fighters with DRFM, with highly configurable self-protection systems, the advent of self-protection pods come in. That was the big step change, I think, for me. Who knows where this goes 50 years from now?
Yeah, and I want to talk about that. So I like how you dipped into World War II, and I know we talked a little bit about that before, but you go back to World War II, not everybody had the same technology, same capability, right? You look at our Department of Navy, they developed the magnetron or cyclotron or whatever, and they end up giving it over to you guys to really help with the war effort. But if you back up, with, I think it was Blitzkrieg, and, very strategic bombing was happening, and everybody was wondering, hey, how can they be so accurate in the middle of night? Sometimes the moon's out, sometimes the moon isn't out. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm a history. I got this from a book here. I was going to go over this, but it was 12 Seconds of Silence in the Splendid and the Vile. 12 Seconds of Silence is by Jamie Holmes. It's about World War II and the V-1 or V-2 bombers and the invention of the proximity fuse here by the Department of Defense, OSRD. And then the Splendid and the Vile is by Eric Larson, who talks about the whole World War, I think it's the World War II effort, where the guys to Churchill and everything went through. So anyways, they're bombing back then. This is like, 41 with just awesome precision, and they can't figure it out. And a guy named, a fairly new hire, R.V. Jones, is in this org, very down low in my opinion. He's just up and coming, and he made the observation that, the receiver sets that the Nazis were using for landing were highly sensitive, and they were using that when the Germans put out these beams, And where they intersected is where, they could hear it tune. You did dash, dash, dot, dot, dash, dot, dot, and all of a sudden you get 0 beat, and then they dropped their bomb. And they thought he was crazy. And so he decided to fly what I would say is a spectrum analyzer. And sure enough, they got the frequencies and they got the beams. To me, that's astounding.
Yeah. Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Well, I mean, because we think, with this technology, we're the smartest, we're the best. But when you have little to work with and little to go on, these guys really knew what they were doing. And the engineering that the Germans had was just phenomenal. But survival makes people do things that they normally do. And I see those ideas flow out of that, certainly from that effort with regards to not only radar, but jamming and everything in between.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's really interesting that the Knickerbein system that you're referring to, the blind bombing system, it's so elegantly simple. Actually, I mean, and like the best ideas that are often the most simple. It's often anything but simple to put them in operation, but the fundamental idea is quite. It's one of those moments you think, of course, yes, absolutely. And what I always think about whenever I'm doing any air travel, which I do quite a bit, is whenever we're landing, I'm thinking the thing that is helping this aircraft get on the ground, if it's an airport with an instrument landing system, is technology that is directly related to those blind landing systems which became Knickerbein, that the Germans had pioneered during the Second World War, and had pioneered beforehand of we've cracked air travel. The Wright brothers proved it. We know how to get from A to B using an aircraft. That's really good. But how do we land in the beautiful weather of Northern Europe?
That's right.
And so every time I'm on a plane, I'm thinking about that, and also all the other things like the air traffic control radio, the transponder, the message we're squawking out on who we are. All of that is owed to innovation in World War II, and it's mind-boggling.
Absolutely, and the sheer scale of the effort. I mean, you look at the amount of vacuum tubes that had to be manufactured. Right. And this stuff is rugged, right? This isn't just the stuff that's made today that's really disposable. These things were just high end, overly engineered for the theater of war. It's funny, you bring up that the landing systems, and I was picturing spectrum. If we had the eyes for it, we're enveloped in spectrum right now. Right. You go back into the 1800s, it's crickets. You got lightning strikes, some natural stuff, magnetic storms, but it's really quiet. I got this thing called, I don't know if you've ever seen it. I'll probably have the FCC or the FBI on me after this podcast, but it's called the Hack RF. I got a good wife. She got it for me for Christmas. What wife gets you a Hack RF for Christmas?
That is such a brilliant present.
Google it. It may be illegal in your neck of the woods, in France, but it has absolutely everything. So right now I'm reading the ADS-B from airplanes that are flying around. This thing is a DERFA. I can record any signal. It's got protocols built in. Any radio, play it back if I want. Of course, it's not high power, but you know very well I could put this into an amplifier and I could redistribute. This thing was $200.
Amazing.
$200, right? You go back 10 years. This thing is, $250,000 worth of lab equipment that fits on, our desks with, a bunch of 6U VME racks or VPX racks. And then you're integrating this thing and then you're hoping it works. And this thing's all just because of silicon. I would say GaN, silicon carbide, all the technologies to get LNAs and HPAs and all that other stuff out the door. I keep missing my screen here. It's just phenomenal. And there's another one here I got. It's called the tiny spectrum analyzer. And these things I use in my lab all the time. I'm probably in my lab every day. I'm not out there hacking or jamming or whatever. I tend to fix old TVs, jukeboxes, and all of that. And you got to align an RF. You got to inject a signal. But my whole point to this is if you go back to Germany, America during the war, we were really, in the British, we were really the superpowers with this technology. We developed it. We used it to win the war. Other people were looking in. Russia's stealing secrets. They're trying to do their thing. But we really own that. And if you look at the rise of America in the UK, it's really because of that technological national security advantage that we had of air dominance, of guided missiles, of just that deterrence that we had. And why I bring this up is all of a sudden, the playing field is really level for everybody, right? I'm not going to give ideas and applications on this podcast on what you could do with this, but I don't know where she got this, but it's a website out there. There's a whole GitHub. There's a whole users nerd community. You got your own variants. I think it's got an FPGA, but the rules in the games have changed on how much money you need to get into these things. You don't have to work for Lockheed or have a defense budget to go ahead and build a DERFM or even a radar. So that being said, I got ADHD, by the way, so I'll tend to vector, but I'm going to edit this mess, so don't worry about it. That being said, if we could go over to, first, I want to define electronic warfare. I would say electronic warfare is anything to do with RF energy spectrum. It's all around us, and sometimes we can manipulate that spectrum and replay it, but that's kind of a vague, nonsensical definition. I'm curious on what your definition of electronic warfare for the context that we're talking about. I'm not talking about cyber or psych ops or anything like that. Just talking about with regards to electromagnetic spectrum.
Well, I sort of define it by thinking of the spectrum that, obviously we've been talking about as an environment. But the weird thing with the spectrum as an environment is it's the only environment that humans have no ability to sense. I mean, if we're by the seaside, obviously we can smell the salt in the air, we can feel the water on our feet. If we go for a walk in the countryside, similar thing. If we're listening to, if we're listening to cars going past, we're using senses that inform us about that environment, whatever that may be. Whereas the spectrum, we can't sense it, but it exists. It's there. It's the size of the universe, ultimately.
Sure. Yeah.
So I always say to people, think about the spectrum as like any environment, like the land environment, the sea environment, space, whatever it is. The difference is that the spectrum is in all of those environments. It's this kind of super environment almost.
That's right.
And what we're trying to do with electronic warfare is we are trying to harness that spectrum for our own military advantage whilst denying the use of that spectrum to our adversaries. So as you mentioned, militaries do loads of things in the spectrum. They use radar to navigate, detect targets, track those targets, engage them. They use radio to, most crucial military thing you can do, keep in touch. Very, very important. And that can either be, through your handheld radios that soldiers have when they dismount, to satellite communications with very sophisticated arrays. And we use the spectrum to navigate increasingly. We have GPS on our phones, global, or GNSS to use the correct acronym, Global Navigation Satellite Systems. And we don't just use that to navigate, we use it as a timing source as well.
That's right.
A lot of people don't realize, their mobile phones depend on a timing source to operate properly. Our computers do. As you and I are talking, there are timing sources that are ensuring that our conversation makes sense. That otherwise it would sound really weird. So in a nutshell, electronic warfare is it's about harnessing that spectrum to your advantage while denying it to your enemies. But that very simplistic definition encompasses a lot of complex missions.
So is this grandiose what I'm about to say? Maybe it wouldn't be true in the 1930s, World War I, because as we talked, this stuff really didn't exist. People were dinking around with crystal radios, and they said, "Oh my gosh, I got a valve or a tube, I can amplify this stuff." And all of a sudden, we're almost in 2026. Whoever controls the spectrum controls the battle or the war or the world. Would you say that's true, or is that like, oh, Luke, you're out of your mind? I would say it's tactical nukes. I would say it's other deterrents. I think it's spectrum. Whoever controls that environment controls everything.
I completely agree. I mean, Field Marshal Montgomery said at the end of the Second World War, whoever controls, if we lose the battle in the air, we lose the war and we lose it quickly. Sure. I think that's still the case for the prevalence of air power, and land and maritime power as well. But I think now you can't hope to prevail in battle, whether that's at the tactical, operational, or strategic level, unless you win and sustain control of that spectrum. Now, winning and sustaining spectrum control, I would further subdivide that into it's a quest for electromagnetic spectrum superiority and then supremacy. And I'm borrowing from the air power world here, but air superiority is defined as effectively you've got a slice of territory, you've got a slice of airspace, And it doesn't matter how big or small that slice is. But
Sure.
what you want to do is to ensure, when you're going for S superiority, you want to ensure that your opponent has perhaps a very basic ability to interfere with your control of that airspace and your use of that airspace as you desire. So that's S superiority. When you get to the stage, as the US-led coalition did in Iraq in 1991, where your opponent effectively cannot use the airspace at all, then you've got air supremacy. And I see it's the same with spectrum. So spectrum superiority, you've got a slice of spectrum in a area, a geographically defined area, and you're trying to prevent your enemy from having any meaningful interference with your use of that spectrum. So that's the superiority. And when you get to the stage where they effectively can't use that spectrum at all, or they choose not to, I mean, that's another thing. You know, they may choose not to because they may think there's no point, we're just going to get jammed, or even worse, whatever's emitting, people will realize our side will realize where it is and then attack it with something nasty.
That's right.
So then you've got the spectrum supremacy. You effectively own that spectrum. So that's sort of how I see that control manifesting itself.
No, that's good. That's good insight, good definition on how you kind of frame that, because it goes right into Russia and Ukraine. I was kind of surprised, right? You saw the buildup of Russia. To me, you know, I'm obviously, you know, I do what I do. I'm not into, you know, I don't know everything, obviously, but you see that build up, and I thought it was obvious, you know, the guy's going to invade. But I didn't think it would be long, to be honest with you, because in my mindset, you know, you look at propaganda, you look at what we're using for technology. Hence, you know, if I have this stuff, you know, you can only imagine what the warfighter has, and I think you already know. I assumed Russia had access to all of this. And what I was astounded with, you know, per the video that we're seeing, and, you know, war is now instant, right? We don't read the newspaper. Everybody's, you know, doing this, and my house got bombed and all this other stuff, which is tragic, by the way. I'm going to deviate really quick on my thought. You know, if my house is being attacked, I'm going to fight back. So I'm totally rooting for Ukraine. I don't think they should give up 1 inch of land. Fight. You got to punch a bully in the nose, if you will. So, you know, they're losing bad, in my opinion, right? If Russia's so big and mighty, you know, got all this oil and all this resource, why is Ukraine, besides the resolve of the Ukrainian people, right? And what is that? Could you attribute that to electronic warfare? Could you clearly say that? Or is it, you know, a lot of some of the parts where it's electronic warfare and it's, you know, whatever. But to me, there's got to be a lot of EW advantages going on. And I've seen some of the drones that have crashed and the teardowns and some of the things they're trying to do with fiber optics and chasing people with drones. I'll show some videos of that in this thing. But what's your rationale? Are you surprised that the war is taking so long? And two, you know, is EW really the gorilla that's given Ukraine their success, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, you make a lot of excellent points, Luke. I think, like everyone, I mean, I didn't really know how to read the operational and tactical situation on the eve of the second invasion back in February 22. Yeah. I mean, my initial thought was this is still Mr. Putin posturing, it's muscle flexing. He'll find an excuse to sort of escalate down from this. Yeah. But then as we saw, you know, that wasn't the case. And I was very impressed with the resolve of the Ukrainian forces. Amazing. And I was also very taken aback by the shocking generalship of the Russian army.
Oh, it was a mess.
Yeah, and talking of the spectrum, the Russians had poured billions of dollars into overhauling their land forces' electronic warfare capabilities, deploying umpteen numbers of systems, all tasked with hitting different parts of the spectrum, hitting communications, hitting radar signals, hitting satellite communications, whatever it was. A lot of these systems have been trialed in Syria where they'd worked pretty well. But the problem was in Syria, when they were going up against ISIS, you know, these ISIS guys were using smartphones. They were using basic Motorola handheld radios. And Russian EW stuff was really, really good against that kind of thing. The moment it comes into contact with encrypted communications, encrypted waveforms, it really, really starts to struggle. So I think the Ukrainians, there was a number of things at play. I think they benefited from kind of how disappointing Russian EW was for the Russian army. I'm sure they were sold that it was going to be a lot better than it actually was. And I think they also had learned, remember the first invasion happens in 2014. So they had, and the Ukrainians do get a bit of a kicking electromagnetically in that first invasion. So there's been a steep learning curve, right? We need to encrypt things. We need to be secure. Ideally, we need to not really use the spectrum unless we have to. So our emissions control got to be really, really good. So I think that became a factor. But there's just one other thing that I'd add to this, which is a sort of intangible, where General Patton once said, and I love this quote, I use it quite a lot. He said, "It's not the size of the dog in the fight; it's the size of the fight in the dog." And I think the key thing was, the Ukrainians are fighting for their survival. Full stop.
Absolutely.
And if you go back, a war that I look at a lot as a comparative analysis with Ukraine is the Iran-Iraq war between 1980 and 1987. And one of the things that you see is that, Iran is shaken up in this revolutionary fervor. They've deposed the Shah. The country's, the country is unstable, let's say. There's this revolutionary kind of spirit behind everything. And a lot of people in the country are swept up in it. This is the new Iran, for better or for worse, but from their perspective. And the Iraqi government and Saddam Hussein sees an opportunity. Look, country's in chaos. We want this stretch of territory. We're going to have it. And he is briefed probably. Listen, Mr. President, it's going to be a bit of a cakewalk. Look at them. They're in chaos. We'll go over it. It'll all be over by Christmas. And we'll be done. And look what ends up happening. And Ukraine was in a similar place where they'd had massive domestic political dislocation, and there'd been this will to sort of change tack, to reach out to Europe, to look towards the West, to look towards the US, to look towards their allies there. And so this gives this underpinning, this fire to things. So I think that's another factor as well.
No, that's good analysis. Going back to Russia's capability, traditionally how things used to work. Say a new emitter pops up somewhere, SIGINT records it. You go back to a depot, you analyze it, and you say, okay, here's a package of countermeasures and things we can do next time. And you kind of got this whole bucket of characterization for these emitters. How long does it take Russia, or has Russia already gained that step function to have parity with Ukraine at this point with regards to electronic warfare, countermeasure, sensing, and those types of things? Or is it because of our embargo on with regards to our microchips and other ancillary components that go into these systems? Is it slowing them down, or is it pretty much becoming parity with EW versus EW and, that whole cat and mouse game that happens?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really pleased you mentioned the cat and mouse game, because that's a real hallmark of EW. There's one side's always getting the advantage, but it's always temporary. That's right. I think what I've seen with Ukraine, there's areas which Russia is strong in. There's areas which Ukraine is strong in. At the moment, much of the electronic warfare battle is characterized by what's happening with drones. So people are trying to jam the other side's drones with greater or lesser degrees of success. In terms of the embargo's not been perfect, but it has made a difference. And Russia is desperately trying to secure chips from the US, from Western suppliers, kind of components it was relying on before the war, and it is having difficulty doing that. No embargo is 100% secure. There's always going to be leakage in that, but the main thing is you get it secure as you can do, and full credit to the US on that score for working really hard, I think. And in a sense, the embargo is a bit of a gift that keeps on giving, because we all know about the collusion between China and Russia, and that's right. You can bet your breakfast that if Russia's having difficulty securing the components it needs, it can't develop its EW capabilities to the level it wants. And therefore, China suffers because China will be keen to get access to that technology as well. So, the embargo, I think, has an impact beyond the Ukraine war, which for us as Western nations and our allies is really, really important.
No, that's fantastic. Good analysis. With regards to you mentioned earlier that you're going to want to be judicious on when you emit. Like picture Ukraine, and you're not always going to be wanting talking on your radio. And I think some of the obvious reasons are you can be targeted, you can be taken out, etc. When you look at these systems, say go back 10 years. You talk about low probability of intercept, low probability of detect, low probability of geolocation. We won't get into the nuances of, exactly what all that is. But do you find, or do you think today in 2025, 2026, that no matter what your system is, no matter what you're doing, as soon as I key in and I say, breaker 19 or whatever it is, or I'm going to send some encrypted data or even just a little packet, doesn't matter how below the noise floor, that given AI capability and training and all of these things that these GPU and FPGAs can do, and these exotic front ends like direct RF, and just look at the whole spectrum of the bandwidth, can you hide anymore, or is that impossible?
I think it's becoming increasingly more difficult to do so. I think there will always be a sort of a trade-off regarding emissions, because I think there will simply be some situations where you just have to admit, there's no way around it. You have to make a transmission. Yeah. I mean, if you take our ballistic missile early warning radars, that's a case in point. The only way really of doing that mission and doing the missions that those radars do, of the confirmation, the satellites get the initial detection, and then the radars do the confirmation. Okay, this is something we need to be worried about, and we need to take action. At the moment, there's arguably no other technologies that can do that to that level of efficiency. So, and that's a kind of classic case where you have to emit. But I think you take the trade-off now, and I think the assumption is, I'm really into this idea of everybody being spectrum-minded. So always think about the spectrum in your daily life. How are you using it? What happens if for any reason you can't access it? And that's as relevant as if you're going to the grocery store, or if you're in a foxhole, in Donetsk, or wherever it may be. And so you have to take that trade-off of, right, well, I have to emit in this situation, but I have to assume that the minute I do emit, I'm announcing where I am, what I'm doing. So therefore, do I need to move? Do I physically need to immediately move location once I've done that? Do I need to make sure my antenna is a long distance away from where I am, and I've got a nice cable connection to keep me safe? It's all of these things you think about, and understanding that trade-off, and going from a position of the assumption is I am detectable. So how do I work around that? Now, you may not be detected, it may be really, really good, but the enemy just has to be lucky once. That's the problem.
Yep. So they're going to be looking for, little spikes coming up, and what they're going to do about that. How do you see, like I thought earlier, I thought the Ukraine war would have been settled by now, to be honest with you. And it doesn't seem Putin, in my mind's eye, Putin's got this long strategic view where I think he actually thinks God has ordained him to kind of to reunify, USSR, and you bring everybody back to the way things were, and you can go back, long time. And I think he's hellbent on that. And I don't think anybody can convince him otherwise. And obviously the damage that he's doing to the Ukrainians, but his own country, and who knows what else. How do you, and I'm not doom and gloom, right? So I don't want to get into this whole Chicken Little and, we're all going to die, we're all going to get nuked. I'm going to touch on that book in a minute. But how do you see this playing out with regards to Ukraine and Russia, and how long? And just, curious on what you think on that.
It's a really great question. I mean, my own feelings are that, writ large, strategically, Ukraine's won the war. I really believe that. I mean, they've won the war for public opinion, firstly, which is crucially important. And Russia simply cannot hope to achieve her strategic objectives. The frustrating thing about the war is that I have to pick my words carefully here a little bit, but I think if certain policymakers in the international community could realize that, this war, I think, could be wrapped up comparatively quickly. Because what I would like to see happening is if there was an agreement amongst Ukraine's allies and within the international community of saying, short of nuclear weapons, we are going to give Ukraine everything she needs to kick Russia out of her territory. And to do that. And the key thing for me is to get the war mobile. Yep. Because once the war can get mobile again, and if it can get mobile on Ukraine's terms, I think the Russians haven't got a look in. Putin keeps waving the threat of the bomb. I mean, this is the only thing he's got, really. Yep. Is he says, if you do this, I'm going to use tactical nuclear weapons against NATO. The ass kicking he would get from conventional weapons that NATO has, if heavens forbid he ever did that, even just detonated a tactical nuclear weapon above the Baltic, we have seen what NATO conventional weapons can do in Iraq, can do in the Balkans, can do in Libya. I would not want to fight NATO in an air war by any means. And Putin deep down knows that. But I think, if as much as he threatens the nukes, I think if NATO threatens the retaliation, and I think the only possibility and the only opening available to the Russian government now is a case, look, the only avenue that you now have is to get out of Ukraine. And if you do that, you might be in a good position to start getting the sanctions lifted that are now crippling your economy, that are doing all this damage to Russia. I mean, Putin, he's not a stupid guy. He must know this. But it's getting a decisive political momentum amongst Ukrainians' allies to say, let's finish this, let's get the resources needed to finish this, and let's determine that victory is Russia out of Ukrainian territory. That's it. Colin Powell always said, have a clear idea of what victory is.
That's right.
I'm a big admirer of Colin Powell.
Yep. It's like the dog that the car, right? What do you do now, right?
That's it. And his whole thing in Desert Storm was Iraq has to be out of Kuwait. That's it. That's mission success. Very simple. Everybody can get behind that. So I think there's things to learn from that.
So you were talking about Putin, and not a psychologist, neither are you, but we all read and analyze the same things. He's not dumb, as you said. He's probably quite brilliant. He's got a very storied career. Not afraid of risk. Maybe lacks a conscience. You said you were surprised that he actually invaded. You thought he would have de-escalated, made up an excuse, an off-ramp. He went all in. Would you be stunned, knowing what you know, if he did absolutely use a tactical nuke on Ukraine? Would that be like the surprise of your lifetime?
Sadly, not necessarily. No, I don't think it would. I would prefer that's not the case. But no, I think he would be capable of using it. Allegedly, he did threaten it. I think it might have been when the Russian position in Kharkiv came under strain. Of course, he did end up losing Kharkiv, and we've only got this as secondhand reports, but apparently both the US and China. Officials from both countries spent a weekend really urging him, like, you trust me, you don't want to go there.
Bad idea.
Because I think the risk for him, what I would hope he realizes is that the moment you do something like that, actually the situation becomes out of your control. Because if you think about when the Trump administration hit Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, after that second use of chemical weapons, the Assad regime had been given warning, and it went ahead and did it anyway. And suddenly, that regime loses control of its own narrative because an exterior actor comes in and, credit where it's due, says, "You're going to stop now, and we're going to make you stop," and that's what happens. And so, actually, from Assad's point of view, you failed in your strategic objective, and it would be the same for Putin. But I think a risk for him now was I think there was a moment probably in the war within the first 9 months, when I think two things could have happened. He probably could have had an off ramp and said, look, I've done this. I've come into Ukraine. I've given you all a bit of a shaking. I've shown you what I can do, and now I'm going to withdraw back across the border and we're going to have a proper talk. So I think he had an opportunity to do that then. And secondly, I think within Russia, there probably was an opportunity amongst people who are concerned with Putin to put a hand on his shoulder and say, listen, Vladimir, we're very grateful for everything you've done of re-energizing Russia, putting us back on the world stage. But now's the time you go and enjoy your dacha, do some fishing, and it'll all be hunky dory, really. Whereas I think now, if there's a move against Putin, it's a bullet in the back of the head, Beriev style. I don't think there is the dacha waiting, and I think he knows that.
Yeah, he's got to be super paranoid now. Everybody always falls out of windows over there, right? I mean,
yeah.
the general, is out a window. And so, going early into this, it was kind of frustrating because, you kind of watch this play out and you say, wow, if Ukraine had the help early and not really heeded the threats of the bomb, this probably would have been over, right? And you got Zelensky coming to the U.S., I think it was Friday, and asking for Tomahawks. And of course, Russia kind of says, well, if you do that, right, we're going to nuke, tactical nukes. So you think if he did something like that, a tactical nuclear bomb within Ukraine, that NATO would not respond in kind, but it would be with conventional warfare because they don't want this absolutely kicking off to a larger scale war. So you think the conventional stuff would be enough to knock out their capabilities, assets, and those types of things?
Yeah, I mean, if it was up to me, kind of thing, and if I was NATO SecGen and we witnessed that horrific scenario, I mean, my response would be an immediate comprehensive series of airstrikes on Russian, things like Russian strategic bomber bases in European Russia, on air bases. Probably wouldn't necessarily go after the political targets at that stage because you'd be wanting to send a message. But, the significant military targets would be subject to a kind of 2003 Iraq shock and awe style attack. And you could probably just do it with air power initially. There's certainly a lot of NATO troops near Russia's borders, but that you'd probably think that you can hold that for the next stage in case you do need to go in and seize a slice of Russian territory and say, listen, you're going to stop now. And if you stop, we pull back. But yeah, I think that was how it would play out. I mean, if we were talking about EW, I think the other thing you'd probably see is a massive both cyber war and electronic warfare employment against Russian targets. I'm sure a lot of that we're obviously dealing with a very secretive world, but I would not be surprised in things like the cyber domain if there's already been plans drawn up on how to bring, effectively how to end the Russian banking system, something like that. Almost certainly there is plans about how to shut down the Russian air defense system that will exist. So yeah, I think NATO has a number of options that don't involve the nuclear option, and not going nuclear would be from a diplomatic standpoint would be a clever move as well, because you could say,
we have to.
Hey,
I think, there's no return. And on that segue, I'm going to read a quote here from the book Nuclear War by Annie Jacobson, right? And you worked with Annie in the book, I think, as Nuclear War Scenario. And so I listened to a lot of books. I had my headphones on. I'm cleaning out my garages. I think it was March. Got 8 kids, so there's always fighting entropy, right? So it doesn't matter how clean you get it, you're going to have to redo it. So Saturday, I got the headphones on, and I'm listening to that book, and I'm thinking, within the first couple of chapters, I'm like, oh my word, right? I mean, this stuff is bad. But it's uncomprehendable. It's almost trying to grasp the size of the universe or the smallness of an atom. I put it in that bucket. It's so hard to comprehend the numbers that are in that book. And all of a sudden, as I'm listening to it, I hear Thomas Withington here. I'm going to quote, "The Russian Aerospace Force has 4 types of ground-based early warning radars potentially capable of detecting ballistic missile salvos." Dr. Thomas Withington tells us, an electronic warfare expert in military radar analysis with the Royal United Service Institute in England. Withington calculated how Russia tracked data and this scenario might come in. And it's very exhaustive, right? And so I'm curious, right? You're out doing your thing. You said you kind of, I don't want to say you fell into this by accident, but you definitely are an expert in this field. And all of a sudden you get a call or an email from Annie saying, "Hey, I'm writing a book on what that scenario looks like of full nuclear war. Can you walk me through how you end up here?" And I'm in my garage listening to you, and I say, "Bing, bing, bing. When I do a podcast someday, I want to talk about this." And so here we are.
Well, firstly, Luke, I'm amazingly flattered that you heard, you heard the very small contribution I made to Annie's book. I mean, that it does mean a lot when people are out there and they pick up on something you've done and you hear about it. And I was deeply honored to have been approached by Annie, and she got in touch with me through the Royal United Services Institute, and we made contact. We had a couple of superb online chats, much like you and I are doing right now, and she really sort of I'm a bit, I can be like a dog with a bone, actually. I mean, if there's something I'm trying to understand, I often don't really rest until I do. And so she had this whole thing about, she explained the scenario, what she was looking at. And she said, well, what would the warning times be like? What's the envelope, the radar's envelope where these things could be detected and tracked? Obviously, as the rockets launch, they're following an arc, a ballistic arc. The world is a sphere. So at what point do they come in with the field of view? And they're only going to be in that field of view for a certain amount of time until they go past it. So it's within that time frame that you have to start making the difficult decisions. So I sat down with you'll enjoy this. You had your lovely spectrum analyzer earlier. My good friend, the scientific calculator.
Sure. Yep.
I love them. 20 of the best euros I ever spent, that was. And so I started doing some calculations, measuring so first of all, ascertaining what would be the likely detection range of the radar. Obviously, we don't know, it's classified, but using open source information about possible antenna gain and power and all those kind of things, that it's all second nature to your good self. And a funny story with this. So I was doing, so let's say it's launched at 2:00 in the morning. How long does the flight take? Average speed of the missile and all this. I got all my calculations done. This was on a Friday afternoon, just before lunchtime. I was looking forward to having my cheese sandwich, feeling very pleased with myself. And then while having the said cheese sandwich, I suddenly realized, yes, but the Earth's round.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, and missiles follow a ballistic trajectory, and I realize I've got a lot of spherical geography, spherical geometry even, that I need to do. Now, the funny thing also with this is that there's a guy called Dave Adami who is a real doyen of electronic warfare. He's kind of written two or three of the seminal texts on EW, kind of the EW 101 book. You know the books. And he has a very useful chapter on spherical geometry. And without that, I wouldn't have known where to start. So the satisfaction I felt of working through those problems was indescribable.
It's good catch. It's actually, this stuff obviously wasn't off the top of your head. It's a very well-researched book. You sat down, did the analysis, you got it back over to Annie, and she compiles this. And that's what I appreciated about this book, is a lot of it wasn't conjecture and theory. It's bounded by, public data, and it's reality. It could be, much worse. It could be not so worse. But the whole point of the book was, our leaders do not have a lot of time to make a decision. No. Say Russia launches, I think the number is under 6 minutes on what our counter is going to be, and then all the other things that go into that. And that's why it makes this whole scenario so dangerous, because given the advent of AI, and we talked a little bit about this before, with deep fakes and audio fakes, and you can't really believe anything anymore. I was telling my wife this. I love watching people fall, right? So they're on ice, they're running, they fall, they dump it. I can't help it, right? They used to be funny. What I find now is I'm not enjoying those videos anymore because I don't know if they're real. It's just not funny if it's AI. And so it's like, man, they just kind of wrecked humor. And I know some of them will have the AI logo, but AI is getting so good where it's kind of the social dynamic. So if you're the president, I'm the president, and you got good intelligence, but that's going to be in the back of your head. How'd you authenticate it? How do you know it's not a spurious? How do you know that Sybers did it's doing its thing? How do you know, right? And God forbid, it's a wrong call. And you heard of those stories where some of these Russian commanders were told in a sub to go, we're at war,
yeah.
and let me second guess this because this message doesn't look right. And he could, World War III would have started. I think that's the challenge with the integrity of the data and information now, and that's part of BW. Is how do you know it's not made up? And to me, that's the biggest threat at this point. I don't think AI is going to go rogue and all of a sudden going to control our missile silos and take over an F-35 and drop, commercial airlines out of the sky. But I do think if you're a clever adversary, you can definitely trigger scenarios that aren't true, but do a lot of damage on a $50 text or whatever you want to call it. What's your thoughts on that with regards to the amount of time and the and AI influencing these types of scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something we have to be hyper aware of, particularly as you say in things like the nuclear realm and warfare generally. I mean, the thought of a conflict starting on the basis of disinformation or whatever it may be, facilitate through AI is very worrying. It reminds me, I mean, going back into history and looking for examples, there was a famous story, I think, when Orson Welles' production of War of the Worlds back in the 1930s, I think, in the US, or 1920s maybe. And it was, on one of the big radio stations, hosted the play. And it is brilliant. You can listen to it on YouTube. It's brilliant. It's scarily realistic. I mean, you sort of think, if you tuned in, listening at home, doing some cooking, and this is sounding pretty real. So
can you imagine sitting there going through that for real? And it's in the 30s, radio's fairly new, and also we're being attacked.
I mean, terrifying.
We now return you to Carl Phillips at Grover's Mill.
Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmot's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. There's more state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit. About 30 of them. No need to push the crowd back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain's conferring with someone. Can't quite see who. Ah, yes, I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted, and the professor moves around one side, studying the object while the captain and two policemen advance with something in their hands. I can see it now. It's a white handkerchief tied to a pole. Flag of truce. If those creatures know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Oh, Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill.
Because you wouldn't, and your avenues of information then were a lot less than they are now. You wouldn't necessarily have a way of corroborating this from another source, and so we're not new to this. I mean, I think the important thing to realize is that the challenges that AI can throw up in terms of us misreading the situation, they're not new, and we found ways of doing it before. I think of steering our way through that before. I think the useful thing with the nuclear enterprise is that from the ground up, for countries that have nuclear deterrence, obviously in the West, US, UK, and France. From the get-go, everything was always about secondary verification.
Authentication.
This very detailed. So a command and control system that can be responsive, that can be agile, but is also very, very secure and has no kind of single point of failure within it. And the interesting thing you mentioned about the Soviet sub-commander, a bit like the Soviet radar guy, one of the big early warning radars who saw a false kind of track. And it's interesting when you go back and you hear about his experience that he just had a hunch that this wasn't right. He had no way of proving it at the time.
I know it.
Just had a hunch, didn't you? Like the sub commander just had a hunch. He just thought, no, hang on, my sixth sense is telling me this isn't right. It's what in the police force, it's what they call in Britain, they call it copper's sense. You know, the cop's intuition.
Yep.
And here we are. And I would always argue that we call it intuition, but intuition is actually the product of years of information acquisition, isn't it?
Yes.
And so I hope we retain that ability to question when we're faced with these life or death decisions, and to act over UK nuclear weapons. So the Prime Minister writes this letter instructing the submarine commander on their recommended course of action. The letter is sealed. It goes into a safe in the submarine. It is never, ever opened. It would only ever be opened in the event of a series of procedures being taken to ascertain this level of dislocation that the UK may have experienced. And when that Prime Minister leaves office, those letters are destroyed. And their content has never been revealed.
And so there's no record, there's no copy, there's no, there's, for posterity's sake, they don't save this stuff. It's no kidding.
No, it's amazing, isn't it? And no Prime Minister, to my knowledge, has ever revealed what they put in the letter. So there's a lot of conjecture. It could be, look, fire all of your missiles at your targets because the UK has been destroyed. It could be actually save the missiles, go and find the nearest allied submarine or fleet or whatever it is, and go and put those missiles at their service. It could be sail as far away from Europe as possible, and go down to the South Pacific and try and set up there. A myriad of possibilities, but it's an interesting thing about how that thing you were talking about. How do you approach such critical decisions in a as robust and integral way as you possibly can?
In 6 minutes.
It's not a lot. I think there's an online game you can do where it simulates you being the president and being given the briefing and then having to take the decision. I mean, it's quite a macabre game, but interesting.
It's, once again, just talking about this, it's surreal. So the question I'm going to ask you, and you don't have to answer it, but in our lifetime, I think we're similar ages. In our lifetime, do you think we'll ever see any nuclear bombs used? Or do you think, I'm not even talking accidents, which is astounding to me that an accident hasn't happened, but just at will, do you think we're at that, the 0 hour, or what's that clock? The doomsday clock. 1 minute to midnight or whatever it is, and they keep moving it all around. And do you think we'll see something like that, like a tactical nuke in our lifetime, or do you think man's wisdom will prevail?
Well, I hope above everything we never do, because it unravels a taboo about using nuclear weapons, and once one person uses them, then the odds on chances other people are going to be tempted. We've got many nations around the world, comparatively, that have nuclear weapons. India, Pakistan. We've got Israel, undeclared nuclear power. We've got nations that could develop them very quickly. Japan, South Korea, technologically advanced nations. We've got North Korea with its rather eccentric, to say the least, leader there. And I hope to goodness that we never see it. But the sad thing is, I wouldn't be surprised if we do. And I take no pleasure in feeling that.
Absolutely.
But I worry that the world is in a very unpredictable place. I think, both you and I remember the later stages of the Cold War. And I think, as frightening as the Cold War was, fundamentally there was a rationality on both sides. The Soviet Union didn't want to be obliterated, and the West didn't want to be obliterated. And above all else, those two blocks found a way of coexisting. Wasn't always perfect. They fought each other in horrific proxy wars around the world. But by and large, global peace, in terms of global conflict, was avoided. What concerns me now, and I think Mr. Putin's is an example of this in a sense, is rash unpredictability on the part of leaders.
Yeah, it's scary.
Yeah, and you know, feeling injurious, feeling an injurious attack on your pride, and then reacting. I mean, we're all human, you know, but reacting in a very rash way, and then suddenly thinking, "Oh no, what have I done?" You know. They do say it's like the thing, isn't it? If you're cross about something, count to 10. I mean, it's good advice actually, and we all try and do that. But what concerns me now is that level of irrationality. The other thing I think that concerns me is that nuclear weapons, in a sense, if you look at India and Pakistan, have not prevented those two countries from fighting each other.
No, they still clash, don't they?
They do. Which means I think you could see. I mean, one thing I do think that is all but inevitable is eventually a NATO-Russia conflict of some sort, toe to toe. I think
so you think
that will happen.
That's coming at some point.
Yeah, I do. I don't necessarily think it will be a nuclear conflict. In fact, I think it almost certainly won't be. But I think,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please.
I was going to say, if Putin is removed, would that kind of of course, we don't know who's going to step into that vacuum, but that could reset all of that and go back to 1989, 1990, and get back to normalcy. Yeah. It's just, think about it. There's one guy who can literally destroy the world if he wanted to. And I ask you this: do you think his leadership would obey that command if all of a sudden he said, "Hey, let's do this today"? Right? Do you think he has that authority structure? Where his leadership would say, "Yeah, we're going to press the button and we're going to do this thing"?
It's a really good question. I think the Wagner Group attempted coup was a really interesting thing to look at, because that, I think, was definitely a warning to him that there are actors within Russia who would take action against you. You do not have the control of the state you maybe think you do. Now, of course, what's happened since then, and where there's been a further consolidation of his power, is certainly a distinct possibility, and almost certainly I think he will have worked to shore up his position. I think the danger with all dictators and megalomaniacs really is that they eventually go down to having a very small cabal of people who are sycophants, effectively, and tell them what they want to hear. But there is a big difference between then saying to your chief of staff, right, execute plan R, to use a Dr. Strangelove analogy, and that general giving a sharp salute, and, yes, sir, and then, for want of a better word, pressing the button. I would hope within Russia that there are, because if the military move against him, in a sense, you could argue that if he gives that order and it is not obeyed, even if he gives the order to you as a tactical nuclear weapon and it's not obeyed, you could almost argue Putin's time is over, because he's lost the ability to command, and the military no longer so it's over for him. But I think the problem for him is, going back to what we were saying earlier in our conversation, over for him 9 months after the second invasion of Ukraine meant the dacha and fishing. Over for him now means a bullet in the back of the head, and probably a hasty cremation in some isolated suburb of Moscow. And I think he knows that. He's getting out in two ways. He's either getting out probably dying in office, or he's getting out through Beryev's star, through a bullet in the back of the head. Either way, it's over for him.
So that we got talking about that off ramp, right? And we kind of, my apologies, I jump all over the place.
No, it's good. I like that.
Going back to that, I would say I agree with that. I think that's his only path. I mean, he could swallow all of a sudden he gets converted and he drops his pride, and he says, "Okay, I was wrong. Let's get our troops out. Let me give you reparations and all that stuff." But I don't see that happening. I mean, he could say, "I'm done." People could revolt and overthrow him. He could get assassinated, or he just, they say he has cancer or some sickness or whatever. But the options at this point do not look reasonable for him.
I agree. I mean, I think What would be interesting is if he tried to do a kind of volte face and actually did a unilateral withdrawal and tried to sell it back to his own people of actually we've achieved everything we wanted to. We've shown that we can make NATO disunited. We've shown that we can create these divisions. We've shown that what we could do to a NATO state if we invaded. So you know what? I've proved my point. It was a successful mission. Of course, he controls the means of information in Russia, so he can spin that narrative exactly how he wants. And he doesn't really need to worry about an uprising amongst the population because of the sheer level of totalitarianism that he's applying to that population. He's probably learned, if you look back at the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the occupation in the 80s, that the disquiet, Gorbachev comes in and starts liberalizing the Soviet Union, and you have these families of people who've been killed in Afghan, and they start protesting the war. They start saying, listen, our sons are not coming back, they're getting killed, and it's a horrific war. And this starts to, and they're allowed to protest because Gorbachev and his regime are encouraging people to start exercising a bit of freedom. And it ended up being part of the undoing of the USSR. And I'm convinced Putin will be very keen not to make that mistake if he does do a unilateral withdrawal. It was a big success. All of you who died, you're all heroes. You stuck it to NATO, you stuck it to the West. That's an option. But and who knows what he'll choose? I mean, he is inscrutable. Never have I seen an individual whose facial expressions give away so little.
I know it. Yeah, good poker face for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Hello again, my friend.
Appreciate this. This is a good conversation. I like how it's kind of, there's an EW component, but this is, the whole Russia-Ukraine thing. It's a real perilous situation for the world. I know we go on with our daily life. Certainly, I can't imagine being Ukrainian trying to work and go to school and just live life with this constant threat.
Yeah.
But if this doesn't get mitigated by the means that we were talking about, this is not good. This is not good. And hopefully it resolves itself soon.
I think you make a really good point about the spectrum too, that it makes you see how the spectrum bleeds into so many aspects of life, in terms of the threat that we now face of civilians doing things like using our GPS.
Yeah.
I remember I was up in Estonia. I spent a lot of time in the Baltic, and I was up in Estonia once, and I was going to a drinks reception. It was the middle of January, very cold evening, a lot of snow, but Tallinn, where I was staying, looked very picturesque. I thought, right, what? Rather than get a taxi, I'm going to walk there. Fancy having a nice stroll. So I've got my phone, I've got the GPS, thought pretty much know the way. Yeah. What I didn't realize was the Russians were jamming GPS.
No kidding.
Yeah. So my GPS started going completely crazy. And, it was suddenly saying I was in the airport or something like that, was like 15 kilometers away. And I did pick up a paper map from the hotel. And so I immediately re-rolled, okay, where am I? Right, use the map. But this just, it goes to show in your daily life how these things can have an impact.
No, it's a great example. I had a similar experience. I wasn't jammed, but, the safest country in the world, I'm told, is, Stockholm, Sweden.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm visiting, I was working for Xilinx. So we're visiting different customers, and I'm walking. My buddy wanted to get back to the train station early because he's one of those paranoid travelers that I got to be there early. And
I'm like that.
I
totally relate to this.
It's 4 a.m. and I had my phone, and we're headed to the train station, and a guy bumps me, and my buddy, he's up running 200 feet ahead. And I'm like, he's trying to mug me. So I pushed him off. We get into the train station. It's closed, of course. And I'm like, I told you we should just, call the taxi. But nonetheless, we get in a taxi. I go to tell my wife that, I'm in the taxi and heading home. I'll see you, late tonight. My phone's gone.
Oh, no.
I'm like, man, how do you get mugged in Stockholm? Right. And then I'm like, I need my phone. And I got to tell you, it's different losing your phone in country. But that was eye-opening to me on how crippling and that feeling you get when you're or whatever, looking for your phone. And, but yeah, it's our daily dependence on spectrum. There is no doubt. And, we try it here in the States. We'll go up into the mountains and we'll say, we're going to, unplug and relax. I got to admit it, after about a day of not checking something, it kind of gnaws at you, doesn't it? You're like,
it's funny how it works, isn't it?
it
Yeah.
is. It's not healthy, but it is what it is.
Yeah, it's and I think it's interesting on the battlefield as well with things like phones, because you find yourselves in a conundrum now where on the one hand, Ukraine has underscored the danger of having a smartphone on the battlefield. You know, you're emitting, okay, it's another device, you know, you can, so first of all, you can be spotted, and secondly, that phone can end up accepting and conveying false information that's been sent by, you know, an electronic warfare enabled malware attack. So rather than just sending a jamming signal, you're now sending malware instead. And so you're getting false information on your phone or demoralizing messages or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So the kind of, in a sense, the obvious antidote to that is to say to the troops, well, listen, don't, you know, your smartphones aren't coming on the battlefield. You're going to leave them at home or whatever.
That's right.
But the problem is that smartphones have proven very important to morale. Because, you know, troops they can stay in touch with their partners, they stay in touch with their families. Yeah, they can just they can just watch The Crown if they want, you know. But these things are really important for keeping the morale up.
You're going to be connected.
Yeah, it's like the equivalent. You know, we were talking about the Second World War earlier and subsequent conflicts. The equivalent of sending a letter back home. You know, if you're in Iwo Jima or if you're in Belgium or something, you know, you're a GI or you're a Marine. So suddenly, okay, I can send that letter back to my sweetheart in Arkansas or whatever, and that's such a crucially important thing. So you've got to weigh up. You have to balance this thing out about how much connectivity on a personal level do you want the soldier to have versus how secure do you want your spectrum use to be. I don't know what the answer is to it, but it's certainly a question that we'll all have to face in the future.
Yeah, there is a high cost to that. You know, you go back to World War II, and I was telling my kids this, that, you know, there's some GIs and warfighters that literally were, you know, in the war for 4 or 5, 400 something days. You know, I mean, think about that. You're not, I know it's kind of shallow sounding, but, you know, you're not home, you're not sleeping in your bed, you're not checking your mail, you're not talking to your wife, your kids, your grandma, your whoever. And that only, that's to day 2, day 3, day 10, week, you know, and it rolls on and rolls on and rolls on. And, you know, they call it the fog of war. But to me, you know, those World War II GIs and the Allies were the absolute people I looked up to as a kid, right? I mean, the sacrifice of, they had to do this. They were young. So, you know, nowadays, I even say with my children, you know, you'll make the excuse, well, they're young, their mind's developing, and get it. Survival kicks in another thing for us. But these people were a different caliber of people to go and sacrifice like they did, and just not being able to see, you know, your loved ones, your kids, your children born, you know, all of these things is why we're having this conversation today. We kind of ride on the backs of that. Yeah,
we do.
But yeah, greatest generation, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, you know, where you see you've seen other conflicts around the world, and you've seen some things, you know, we've experienced since, and it's amazing. I was watching. There's a brilliant film that I'd really recommend to your audience. It's a documentary film, and it's called 20 Days in Mariupol, and it was done by a group of journalists who were stuck in Mariupol, which is on the sort of South Ukraine coast, while that was being laid siege by the Russian army, so about February, March 2022. Okay. And it's an incredible piece of filmmaking. And what's really, you know, despite all the horror that you see in this, I'm going to sound strange saying this, it's one of the most motivating things you can watch, because you see these people who have had, you know, like ourselves, very, you know, we all live quite ordinary lives. We, you know, you in your garage, me in the grocery store, you know, we do our day-to-day things, and suddenly our lives are turned upside down. And I think what struck me was that you had these people, men and women, who did not realize the fortitude that they actually had, buried way deep down there somewhere, probably very much to do with our primal survival instinct, but suddenly faced with this horror, become very, very focused on, right, what can I do to help? How can I help my neighbors? What do I need to do here? What do I need to do there? And never complaining about it, just almost going into a kind of automatic mode. And it struck me like that after 9/11, actually, in the States, where you saw these massive queues by recruitment offices of people who probably never not necessarily been interested in the military, maybe didn't know much about it, but suddenly like, no, my country's under attack and I'm going to go and do, this is about something far bigger than me.
That's right.
This is about the whole way of life that I enjoy and what I take for granted. And I was speaking to a neighbor recently and they've got a couple of kids and they were saying, well, if the war came, I'm not sure I would be there joining up and all this. And I said to them, you say that now because you're sitting by a swimming pool and we're having a nice drink and it's a lovely evening. But if you suddenly get a morsel land on your roof, you never know. You might become the most angry, resentful person you've ever seen and be the first in the queue at the recruitment office the next day. You never know how you'll be until you're put, heavens forbid it, I would never wish it on anybody. But, until you're in that situation, you never know how it's going to be. And that's something that really interests me, I think.
It is. And I think that, I don't want to say it's not human nature, but it is kind of in us. But you look at the countries that have been successful during war, it is definitely in those people to go do that. And I think you're right. The motivation, like for me, is definitely my family, right? It's, if it was just me and you're doing your own thing, I don't seem to care as much, but definitely not, you want to protect not even necessarily your property, but your family and make it sure they're going to be safe. It's consuming. And it goes back to the whole communication thing. If I was in World War II for 400 and something days, I'd be worried they're worried about me, right? I want to send that clear because I want them to know I'm okay. Don't worry. And then they can't get it. Your mom's going to worry or your wife's going to worry or those types of things. But yeah, going back to that communication, two more things we'll wrap up. First is, you look at EW and you look at different mission packages and scenarios and you look at the war in Israel. And you look at Mossad, right? And I don't know if you've ever read the book. I'm going to list the book in this podcast of all the books that we've been talking about. It was Killing the SS by Bill O'Reilly. And some people like Bill O'Reilly, some doesn't, right? He leans conservative. I'm not going to get into politics, whatever. But it's a splendid book on, what Israel and the Jews did. And some of it was out of duty. Some of it was out of bitterness and resentment and just closure. But, hunting these guys down that ran these concentration camps one by one. And some of these guys, I forget their names, literally gave the next 40-something years of their life on this mission. And so you look at this beeper attack. I forget when it was, but basically, right, they became the middleman or a manufacturer. I think they started up a fake manufacturing place, made beepers, put C4. Very easy design, right? They controlled the cell tower and the beacon and all of that. And at the right place at the right time, bang. And I think, one, that's amazing because there's a whole business aspect of it. There's a whole secret aspect of it. And then there's the whole getting, this material into your enemy's hands and then timing it correctly to create that psychological damage that, oh my gosh, how do I know my phone's okay or my radio's okay? Or, what else did they do to me? Out of the last public things that I've seen with regards into, I'll call that EW-ish. I thought that was absolutely stunning. Curious on what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I share your opinion. I mean, I'm always a bit in awe of the Mossad. I think of all of the intelligence services, they really are. They're imaginative. They're impressive. Okay, there is now a question within the Israeli polity of to what extent was prior warning of the 7th of October attacks received and to what extent was it actioned on. The thing I always say about intelligence services is unfortunately for highly professional intelligence services, which, in the UK, in France, in the US, elsewhere in Europe, in Israel, we're very lucky to have. I said that the worst thing for them is you only ever hear about them when things fail. You never hear about the successes. Here I am in my nice apartment block in France. Rightly, I never hear about probably the scores of attacks per day that are stopped.
That's right. Yep. Who knows how many?
Or the Russian operatives trying to do whatever they're trying to do to the rail network that are stopped. So I think the Mossad attack is really interesting because it harks back to something else as well. So there's that tactical ingenuity behind it for strategic effects. But also when you look at the history of the Israeli armed forces, here we've got bunch of folks who were in these effectively in what we would consider insurgency organizations today. So people like the Sterngang, Irgun, they're fired up. They know exactly what they're fighting for. Their community's just been through the most unimaginable horror. And here they are trying to forge this new country that's currently occupied by the Brits, that nation who are responsible for more Independence Days than any other country on the planet. So, here they are. The Brits are weary at the end of the war. The country's bankrupt. And you've got this group of young, very dynamic and tactically imaginative insurgents who know what they're fighting for. So they already start from a position of fighting asymmetrically. So if you imagine your armed forces are forged around this idea that you are going to fight asymmetrically because you've got no other choice, and then you extrapolate that down the line as you develop as a nation, and you start to get incredibly imaginative things. And a thing that strikes me with Mossad that I think about a lot is you take the attacks on the pagers. Do you remember when they did that, allegedly did that hit in the UAE a couple of years back where they used fake passports to infiltrate and all of this? And the thing about the Mossad is they'll never do the same thing twice. And that's something I think so clever.
It is. I agree with you. I think it's in their DNA, and I think it's part of their heritage. I'm not going to go into Bible times and all of that, but it's definitely ingrained into them. A different way of surviving. But it was absolutely stunning and impressive. Some people thought it was sick or whatever. And I'm like, hey, October 7th didn't happen to me. I don't know what my reaction would be. But what I saw is absolutely, once again, the depravity of man on what goes on here. And so, power to them. If they can do more attacks like that, have at it. The psychological damage was absolutely
I mean, I think, as you say, that the psychological impact is you've got the material damage, the physical damage to Hezbollah and Hamas as insurgent organizations, but then the consequence of the strategic impact of you put your enemy on the back foot. It reminds me of the thing I heard years ago actually about the provisional IRA in Northern Ireland, and I remember going to a presentation and there were people from the UK intelligence service there, and they were saying one of the reasons why the IRA and their political masters eventually decided to explore negotiation with the British and come to some kind of political settlement was that they believed they were so infiltrated at that point by the UK intelligence community that any chance of realistic mission success was becoming more severely compromised by the day. So it's almost you get into this kind of decision-making paralysis. You say, do you know what? We're not even going to plan a bombing because we've got no guarantee we're even going to pull it off.
I already know. Yeah.
And the clever thing about that, if you're the UK intelligence service, you don't even necessarily need to do the infiltration. You just need to make your adversary believe you have done.
Yeah.
And there you are.
The whole psychological part of this stuff is very interesting to me. And then even go back to the Mossad and the beeper, and hopefully this doesn't sound gross, but it's reality, right? That you know where the beepers are located, right? And so it's almost like they're decapitating the manhood.
Well,
right?
I mean, that's true. Yeah.
Getting kicked in the groin, let alone, his bits and pieces blowing off because there's a beeper there. So to me, it just goes beyond that because, most of these guys are men that are going to be fighting these things. And so I think there's a thought process that goes with this. And I'll be honest with you, I would love to be on a program someday that does stuff like this,
amazing,
right?
Like, I know.
So wrapping up, I do want to thank you for today. I thought it was a really good conversation. Thank you once again for, being my first here for the podcast and bearing with me. I just want to go and extrapolate and say, what does the future of EW look like? We know the trends of silicon and technology and silicon carbide and GaN, but fundamentally, it's still all about Maxwell and Faraday, right?
Yeah.
It's really boring. My wife, I'll play it at night, listen to a book at night and go to sleep. She has to bear with, Faraday and Maxwell and the electromagnetic field. It's like a 19-hour book, but it starts with Davy Humphreys and it works with Faraday and it goes all the. Oh, you gotta listen.
Oh man, this sounds fantastic.
It is. Most people would be like, "Oh man, nerd,"
No. That's my kind of thing.
And it's still about that spectrum. So I see two confines here. I see one where there's whatever it is, this black hole, this thing that can control electromagnetic waves. Doesn't exist yet that I know of, where you can just manipulate it on that thing. And when you're out jamming yourself and these types of things, or advances in all the science and technology that goes into EW. And you look at AI and you look at all of these trends, where do you see, does EW even get to the point where, it's going to sound crazy, where it's just not even effective anymore?
That's a really good. It's a really good question. I mean, I think that there's a couple of things to think about. Firstly, as you mentioned, we operate within the straitjacket of physics ultimately, and Faraday and Maxwell and Hertz and all of our heroes and Marconi, they've effectively set the rules of the game. And short of some massive, significant discovery, which we can't rule out with things like investigations into quantum and some really cool science that's being done, we, for the foreseeable future, we operate within those confines. But I think where we will see decisive change is the speed of electronic warfare will just continue to increase. They say that EW operates at the speed of light. Yes, to an extent it does, but the human thought process doesn't necessarily.
Speed of life, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So we operate, the machines operate at the speed of life, but we operate the speed of our own cognition ultimately. What I think AI is going to do is it's going to speed up that decision-making process. I agree with something you said earlier, that the human will still be in the loop. And I think a reason they will be is because there is no desire amongst any militaries to hand over decision-making to the machine. I've spoken to scores of people about this in the defense industry, in the military, in the political circles, and the answer is, seriously, it is unambiguously the same. Never.
I heard no. No.
Yeah. So I think that certainly in our own Western allied militaries, I think that'll be the case. But I think what AI will do is it will accelerate things, because the spectrum is now so condensed. It's so complex. At the start of the podcast, you were saying if we were having this conversation, well, we couldn't have this conversation in 1850 because we wouldn't even really know about this. We know about lightning. We get the first tentative experiments being done with electricity. People are kicking around with it. But electricity to them, to those people then, was what quantum is to us now. We're feeling around. We're starting to explore this. So I think AI, what it's going to do is it's going to help us make sense of that hugely complex spectrum and these billions of signals within it, one of which we need to find in order to, first of all, to understand what it is and then to jam it. And there's simply no way I think that the human brain can do that anymore. But AI provides the tool to help the human brain understand that situation. We may well see also AI being instrumental in rapidly composing jamming waveforms against particular emitters. That process in the Second World War took, as we said earlier on, could take weeks or months. Then in the epoch we find ourselves in now, it may take hours or minutes, but we're going to be looking at things taking thousandths of a second in that score, and that will need to happen because the waveforms we want to jam are constantly changing.
That's right.
AI will ensure they won't stay the same. So in a nutshell, I see a significant acceleration of how we perform our mission. But I think if we took my hero Edward Addison, father of electronic warfare for me, and we took his friend R.V. Jones, and we took their friend Joan Curran, and we transport them in our time machine into the future, 50 years now, I think, the five of us, we're sitting, we're having a cup of tea, and I think our three friends, our three experts will still be saying, okay, it's mind-boggling how you do this, but fundamentally, you're still doing the same thing we did.
That's right.
I think that will be the case.
Yeah, because it's all about the physics. You said a sexy word earlier. You said quantum. If I wanted to start my business, it should have been Delta Fringe, Quantum, AI, ML, whatever.
Oh, wow.
Well, quantum, I keep up on it and I read all over, and you hear China and their quantum radar. And the whole idea is you entangle. So therefore, the reflection or the received signal is always yours. It's got integrity. It's authenticated. Are we going to really see quantum radar, quantum EW, where once again, I was saying it before, will EW become irrelevant at that point? I can't imagine it will be, because whatever you come up with, there's always a countermeasure.
Yeah.
And so is it that paradigm shift from the traditional Maxwell's equations into this new world where, hey, there's monopoles and who knows what else, right? That's going on out there to communicate. It's interesting. I don't know enough about it, and I think that's obvious to you. But how fast could that really change, right? And whatever country has that advantage, all of a sudden wins that spectrum dominance I was talking about by controlling the world, controlling the war, controlling really what we think and do and see, right, on the internet and all of that. Just curious on what your thoughts are with quantum, or is it all just just marketing and fluff?
It's again another excellent question. I mean, the technology is captivating, I must say. I like yourself. I don't really feel I know a huge amount about it. I'm a very enthusiastic student. I'm very, very, very keen to learn more, and I'm trying to educate myself on it. But I tend to I probably going to sound quite boring. That certainly looking at the area that I kind of specialize in. I tend not to see things in big bang terms. I think that often, even if you take a technology like radar, on the surface of it, okay, Watson Watt does this amazing pioneering experiment in the late 1930s. And suddenly, wow, that's it. Well, my word, look, radar's a workable technology. Well, yeah, I mean, he demonstrates the feasibility of it, but he stood on the shoulder of giants, and a lot of people have done a lot of very important preparatory work there. Yeah. So you could argue there's an incremental process that underpins all science. The Big Bang is in the eyes of the public imagination, I think, because it's often when the general public suddenly become aware of a technology. So I tend to think with quantum, we may see a similar thing, that we'll see this incremental adoption of certain aspects of quantum technology into the EW mission set, as we'll see the adaptation of certain processes driven by AI into the EW mission set. But I don't necessarily think we'll see, 17th of March, quantum EW kicks in and it changes everything. Understood. I think it's iterative rather than revolutionary, I suppose, which I know is really boring, isn't it, to say that?
It could be. So you don't think all of a sudden AI one day is going to puke out, oh my gosh, we solved this unifying whatever for radar EW. You do still, even with AI, you think the knowledge and the system building is still going to be incremental.
Well, I could. That's again another really good question. I mean, cynically, I hope it does stay incremental, because very cynically, it keeps me in a job at the end of the day. Yeah, and it keeps me, keeps me in supplies of cake and fine wines, so to speak. So, yes, he would say that, wouldn't he, kind of thing. But I think, I do tend to think most scientific advancement is iterative. I mean, if you take something like nuclear fusion, we've been talking about cold fusion for a very long time. We've been on the cusp of it for a very long time. And eventually, probably something will come along that will make cold fusion a feasible prospect for power generation. And yes, that will change our world, but that process will be the culmination of, and initially, it's one of those things, isn't it? Initially, if someone cracks workable cold fusion, it'll be, oh great, this is workable, and it's still horrifically expensive. Because what you'll then need other advancements that enable that process that you've perfected to become a feasible reality for us all to use. So every advancement, when you get to a particular stage, the advancement that you've then achieved is then dependent on another series of things to make it a feasible prospect. So
really just technology readiness curve, right? TRL, right? Technology readiness level. And so in our here we'll say, hey, I got this concept, it's TRL 0, I can jam this whatever. And then all of a sudden, how do I get into the warfighter's hands? And what is that from TRL over 0 to 10, could be billions, it could be trillions, who knows? So, and that's the great ingenuity of some of these inventors, is not only they had the idea, but they carried it forward and actually implemented it and scaled it. I know you're pressed for time, and I do want to thank you for being my first victim.
Luke, it's been an absolute pleasure. I could have chatted to you for hours. I mean, alas, I've got folk. You've got merch.
I got a gift for you, so I'm going to send you a sweatshirt. I need to know your size. All right,
that is beyond generous, my friend. I will wear it with pride.
Do you like hot sauce?
I love hot sauce.
This recipe's been perfected for 30 years. Everybody says I should sell. I'm not saying this out of pride. It is the best hot sauce on chicken wings. And so I'm going to send you a complimentary bottle.
Friend
And
for
so-
life.
It's almost like if Delta Fringe doesn't work, I'm going to, hawk my hot sauce.com.
Oh, well, funnily enough, so here's a sort of a little thought for you for the end. First of all, that is very, very kind of you, and I'm hugely grateful.
Let me know what you think.
And funnily enough, so sadly, the reason I've got to wrap up is I am cooking a curry this evening because I've got some folk coming round for supper, and I like one of my passions in life is cooking, and so I am a big fan of hot sauce, and I can promise you that your hot sauce will have a very short and very happy life in my kitchen, and I will be sending you pictures of the dishes that I prepare with it and the recipes, my friend. So stand by.
This is all homegrown stuff, by the way, right? And so this is all out of my garden, and like I said, I've been working on it for years. And if I ever need to, I'll start a hot sauce company. But hot sauce market is pretty saturated, right? And everybody and their mother's got a hot sauce. But for now, what I'm going to do is
this is your hot sauce, though.
That's right, it's mine.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you one of these.
Oh, bless you.
Give you some hot sauce, and we're going to keep in touch.
We are.
I really appreciate it. I think you shared so much to the community, and it'll be interesting to see what questions, what else spawns from this. But let's keep in touch, and God bless, and enjoy your curry.
Luke, thank you so much, my friend. Needless to say, if ever you find yourself in southwest France, there is a big pot of cassoulet waiting for you, and some good food and some good chat and some good times. So don't be a stranger. We will indeed keep in touch. Let me know when the podcast is out, because we'll promote it with our channels as well.
I appreciate it.
And let me know. I can also, if you need any help, think of guests, that kind of thing, give me a shout. I know a lot of kind of weird and crazy people who are good.
Yeah, I love it. That's exactly what I wanted. And I think I used to come to your neck of woods. I think Talus is in your backyard.
Okay. Oh, yeah, just down the road, my friend. Yeah, so you know the hood already. That's great. I mean, there's some cool places I can take you to.
All right. Thanks again, sir.
All right, my friend. Listen, Luke, thanks again. Lots of love. Big hugs going to you. Let's talk again soon.
Yeah. God bless.
Take care. Ciao for now.